It's already hard to accept that my father-in-law passed away. But what my husband Bob said next left me completely shocked. Let's get divorced. Now that I've got the inheritance, I don't need you to be my ATM anymore. For a moment, I couldn't believe what Bob was saying. What do you mean? I asked. Bob grinned and smugly explained, I have about $1 million from my dad's inheritance, so I don't need you anymore. Then Bob started complaining about me. Do you know how embarrassed I've been? I had high hopes because my dad arranged our marriage, but I was disappointed to end up with someone as plain as you. Well, why did you marry me then? You could have just said no, I replied. It's obvious, isn't it? For the money. Who else would marry someone like you? I couldn't stay silent after hearing that. Fine, here's the divorce papers. I decided to agree to the divorce without telling Bob something important. I hope he regrets this deeply later. My name is Catherine Smith, and I'm 42 years old. I run a fashion company. I married Bob, who is 2 years younger than me, 2 years ago. Our marriage was arranged. Bob is the son of Mr. Smith, the CEO of a company I've worked with for many years. Being an only child, it seemed Mr. Smith initially intended for Bob to succeed him, but Bob showed no interest and wasn't particularly good at his job. So Bob quickly dropped out of the running for successor and just worked as a regular employee. What attracted me to Bob? His laid-back nature. Since childhood, people often told me I was too serious and lacked spontaneity. I was often praised for being studious, but some people found me too stiff. Some of my ex-boyfriends even told me, "You're not fun. It's like I'm dating a boss." It was heartbreaking, but I always felt maybe I was too serious. Being labeled as inflexible was a common occurrence. I struggled with handling things casually and often got too engrossed. To me, Bob seemed like he was from a completely different world. "Oh, the place is closed today," Bob said during our first date. He had recommended a restaurant, but it was closed when we got there. Now, I would have been flustered by such an unexpected situation, but not Bob. "Let's just go to that diner over there," he said, effortlessly changing plans. For someone as rigid as me, his response was a revelation. I thought by being with him, I could also become adaptable. That's why I decided to marry him. Many people were against our marriage. Some even suggested I could find someone better. Even Mr. Smith, my father-in-law, wasn't very enthusiastic. "Are you sure you want to take on my son? It feels like I'm burdening you with him," he asked. Back then, I felt no one really understood Bob's worth. But maybe they were right. Soon after we got married, Bob quit his job without consulting anyone. He just stopped going to work. When both I and Mr. Smith asked him why, Bob casually said, "Why do I need to work if you are making money for both of us?" My father-in-law and I were so taken aback that we didn't know what to say. Why would he rely solely on me for income? "Oh, the place is closed today," Bob said during our first date. He had recommended a restaurant, but it was closed when we got there. Now, I would have been flustered by such an unexpected situation, but not Bob. "Let's just go to that diner over there," he said, effortlessly changing plans. For someone as rigid as me, his response was a revelation. I thought by being with him, I could also become adaptable. That's why I decided to marry him. Many people were against our marriage. Some even suggested I could find someone better. Even Mr. Smith, my father-in-law, wasn't very enthusiastic. "Are you sure you want to take on my son? It feels like I'm burdening you with him," he asked. Back then, I felt no one really understood Bob's worth. But maybe they were right. Soon after we got married, Bob quit his job without consulting anyone. He just stopped going to work. When both I and Mr. Smith asked him why, Bob casually said, "Why do I need to work if you are making money for both of us?" My father-in-law and I were so taken aback that we didn't know what to say. Why would he rely solely on me for income? I tried to convince Bob many times with the help of my father-in-law, but Bob's way of thinking never changed. "Even if I work, I can't earn as much as Catherine does," he'd say. Right after we got married, Bob boldly declared he'd be a freeloader, and I was tempted to divorce him then and there. If he was a young man in his 20s, maybe I would have found it cute. But this attitude was coming from a man nearing 40. Eventually, we reluctantly agreed that he'd take care of the household chores. Bob's parents had divorced a few years earlier. Apparently, before the divorce, Bob's mother wasn't very good at housework. She couldn't do anything, so I never learned from her, Bob said. It seemed like Bob was making excuses, blaming his mother for his lack of domestic skills. True to his word, initially, Bob was clueless about housework. But with consistent praise and guidance, he managed to handle basic tasks. However, That doesn't mean he became exceptionally good at it. Still, he seemed quite pleased with himself. Thanks to me taking care of the house, Catherine can work. You should be grateful, Bob would say confidently, which often bothered me. But I didn't think it was worth arguing over. Yes, Bob, I really appreciate your help, I'd reply, forcing a smile. There were moments when I felt annoyed, but overall, I think we managed to get along quite well. About a year into our marriage, something significant happened. My father-in-law adopted a child, a 9-year-old boy named Jack. Jack seemed like an ordinary boy, but my father-in-law isn't someone who makes decisions without reason. So why did he suddenly adopt Jack? One day, when we were alone, I asked him. He replied, "Promise you won't tell anyone," and then explained. It turns out Jack was the child of an employee my father-in-law was fond of. They had a close relationship, but tragically, Jack's parents died in an accident. They had eloped, and Jack didn't have any close relatives to rely on. Otherwise, he would have ended up in foster care. While my father-in-law wasn't sure if Jack would be happy with us, he decided to adopt him, hoping it would be for the best. I see, that's very kind of you. Although Bob and I didn't have children, we had quite a bit of freedom. Please rely on me if you need anything, I said. My father-in-law smiled warmly upon hearing this. Thankfully, afterward, he did rely on me from time to time, just as I had offered. On nights when he couldn't make it back from work or had pressing commitments, I took care of Jack. At first, James was a bit hesitant, but he quickly warmed up to me. He's either very friendly or trying hard to fit in. Thinking about it made me feel somewhat emotional. Bob, on the other hand, wasn't happy about the situation. It seemed he wasn't welcoming toward Jack. I could understand his mixed feelings, knowing his father took in a stranger, but when I tried talking to Bob, it turned out he had a completely different concern. Adopting him? What's he thinking? This is going to cut into my inheritance. I was hoping to get everything, he said. I couldn't believe my ears. Bob wasn't conflicted about Jack. He was worried about the inheritance. I'm going to talk to Dad about this. I'm not cool with it. One day, Bob said this and went to confront his father. When he returned after a while, to my surprise, he was in a strangely good mood. I cautiously asked a smiling Bob, "How did it go?" He replied, "Oh, it's all good. My share isn't changing." Huh? What do you mean? I asked. I always thought that even if someone is adopted, they still get the same stuff from family when someone dies. What's happening? Noticing I didn't understand, Bob explained proudly, "Dad's making Jack give up his right to get stuff when he's gone. It's because I'm his real son." I was surprised. Could the father-in-law who talked about Jack so nicely really be planning to give him nothing? Something seemed wrong. I wasn't sure, but Bob seemed happy about it, saying, "I'm glad. Well, if my father-in-law says so, there must be a reason. Anyway, he's still young. We won't deal with his stuff for a long time. Maybe I'd divorce Bob before then, who knows?" I was thinking about this casually, but things changed quickly. A year later, my father-in-law had an accident and didn't come back. I didn't expect to lose him so soon. I knew him longer than I knew Bob. He was a good man in his job and at home. Hearing the news was sad. I couldn't stop crying, feeling a deep sense of loss. My eyes were swollen, and my head hurt, but I made myself get ready for the funeral. Bob was supposed to be the one mourning the most, but he seemed distant, like he wasn't really feeling it. His dad had died suddenly. Maybe he was so shocked he couldn't believe it was happening. So, I took charge to organize everything for my father-in-law's farewell since Bob seemed distant. During the funeral, I held back my tears as best I could, but the hardest part was seeing Jack cry. Bob, on the other hand, didn't shed a tear. I found it strange. Instead of being sad, he seemed fidgety or even happy. Later, I figured out why. "Bob, something seems off with you. Aren't you sad about your dad?" I wanted to express my worry about his lack of tears, but his response surprised me. "Oh, I'm definitely sad, but I'm also kind of excited. Oops, I guess I let that slip, huh?" He chuckled. "Come on, Catherine, Dad was the CEO, right? He must have left a lot of money. How much do you think he left behind?" I thought Bob was just lost in thought, but from before the funeral until now, he hadn't shown any grief for his father. He was smiling, thinking about the money he'd inherit. "What's gotten into you?" I exclaimed. "Well, think about it. We're divorced, and my mom isn't getting any of it. I'm his only real child. Jack, being adopted, won't get any inheritance, so it's all mine. You think I can't be happy about that?" Bob had a smirk like he was about to burst into laughter any second. Seeing him like that made me want to slap him. That's how happy he looked. He was genuinely delighted deep down that my father-in-law had passed away. I can't believe it. Say whatever you want, I said, feeling like leaving right away. But before that, I had to talk to Bob about Jack. Since my father-in-law was gone, I'd asked Bob to let Jack stay with us for a while. If not, Jack might end up in foster care. I wanted to raise him myself. Jack, you're okay with taking him in? Bob surprisingly agreed. He smiled. Sure, Catherine. What you do has nothing to do with me anymore. Then he handed me a piece of paper. It was green, a divorce paper. What's this? I asked, confused. Let's get a divorce. Now that I've got the inheritance, I don't need my personal ATM anymore, Bob said coldly. For a moment, I couldn't grasp what Bob meant. Did he just call me an ATM and say I'm not needed anymore? What do you mean? I asked. Bob smirked proudly and told me I got around $1 million from my dad's inheritance, so I don't need you anymore. With this much, I don't have to work, I don't have to please you, and I don't have to bother with chores. Isn't it great? Bob exaggerated his excitement with big gestures. I was deeply shocked by Bob's behavior. The inheritance was money that came after my father-in-law's death, but Bob acted like he hit the jackpot. He didn't seem to mourn or remember my father-in-law at all. He was genuinely happy. But money can change people. It's common for folks to act differently after coming into a lot of money. Maybe Bob's just getting carried away by the huge sum. Calm down, Bob. Let's talk about this, I said, placing my hand on his shoulder. Bob shrugged off my hand and yelled at me angrily. Shut up, you boring woman. I only married you because my dad introduced us and you were a CEO. But I always felt suffocated with you. It's been hard for me. Bob went on, listing his complaints against me. I was so disappointed when I expected someone better from the arranged date my dad set up, but then ended up with someone plain like you, he continued. If that's how you felt, you could have just said no to the marriage. I never forced you or begged you to marry me. I shot back. I couldn't accept being painted as the villain. So why did you marry me then? If you didn't want to, you could have declined. It's obvious, for the money. Who else would marry someone like you? Bob mocked, laughing at me. Basically, you married me for my wealth, he admitted. It's been a while, so I guess it's safe to say. Bob started, revealing a shocking fact. I had a significant debt. My dad said if I changed my ways and devoted myself to you, he would pay it off. So of course, I would marry you. It meant he never loved me. He just married me for the money. Well, it wasn't fun, but thanks to you, I was saved. Thanks a lot. Seeing Bob laughing so cruelly, I made up my mind. I didn't know this man anymore. I decided not to give him the advice I had planned and started filling out the divorce papers without hesitation. Bob, who had been pushing for the divorce, seemed a bit surprised to see this. Hey, are you thinking of getting a divorce now? Fine, here's the divorce papers, I said after writing them, feeling a sense of accomplishment. Now we were total strangers. Yeah, whatever happens now doesn't concern the other. You can live with that kid, Jack, and I can hang out with younger women. We're free. Bob was ecstatic. From what I could see, he hadn't cheated during our marriage, which surprised me. I never suspected it, but that was interesting. Bob, if you were this happy about it, you should have divorced sooner. I had my reasons. I wanted the money. Bob carelessly stuffed the divorce papers into his bag and left the house in a hurry. I didn't feel right staying in the house where I'd lived with Bob. I thought about starting fresh somewhere new with Jack. It seemed like a good time to sell the house and move. I wanted to live close to my parents' place. I think it would help both Jack and me. Jack would have to change schools, but he said that's okay. It's a bit sad, but now we can look for a new place without any reservations. Finding a new place was a bit tricky, but after thinking it over, I made a decision. What mattered most were the short distance to my parents' place and the great location. It's expensive, but considering Jack, I believe it's the best option out there. Jack came along to see the property, and his eyes sparkled at the sight of the luxurious house. It's spacious and beautifully decorated, with lots of storage space, which was important to me. Surprisingly, it even has a pool. I didn't really need one, but seeing Jack so excited made it worth it. Wow, this is amazing, Jack exclaimed. It didn't really matter where I lived, but seeing him happy was what counted the most. And so, we moved in. It took some time for both Jack and me to get used to it, but eventually, our new house became a comforting place for us. Around that time, I got a call from Bob. He sounded desperate and said he wanted to meet and apologize immediately. I had a feeling why he suddenly wanted to talk. I could have ignored him, but since he was so insistent, I decided to meet him. I left Jack with my mother and headed to the diner we agreed upon. Bob was already there, sitting in a corner booth, looking pale and about to cry. "Catherine," he called out as I approached. I gave Bob a cold look as he stood up. "What do you want, Bob? We're supposed to be strangers now." "Don't say that. The truth is, my dad had debts." "Damn, I never thought he'd." "Wait, didn't you get $1 million from your inheritance? Just use that to pay off your debts," I said, cutting him off. "No, the debts are more than what I inherited," Bob explained. He had more debt than the money he got. Bob inherited both money and debts from someone. I didn't know I'd have to pay off the debts too. Bob looked defeated. "Catherine, you must have some savings. We used to be married. Please help me," he begged with a flattering smile. But did Bob forget what he said before? "After all the times you made me feel small, even calling me an ATM, why would I want to help you now?" It was bold of him to ask for help. He said he wanted to say sorry over the phone, but he hadn't yet. "You really regretted marrying me, huh? After everything you said, now you want help?" "Well, back then, I never thought I'd be in this situation," Bob tried to explain. His sudden need for help surprised me. Maybe he thought he wouldn't need my money, but now he's asking for it. "Sorry, I can't help you. I don't have the money." "What do you mean? I heard your business is doing great," Bob argued. "That's not true. I wish he'd stop blaming me for his mistakes. I'm not lying. I just don't have money to lend. Not every bank lends to everyone, right? Why would I lend if I don't expect it back?" Bob looked guilty for a moment, remembering how harsh he'd been to me, but he didn't apologize. He was too proud. "Why are you being so cold? Don't you care about me?" "Oh, did you forget what you said when we divorced? We're strangers now, nothing to do with each other." Weren't those your words? I couldn't understand how he could act like he was the victim. How can he ignore everything he said before? I might have said that, but I didn't mean it. I never thought things would end up like this, Bob said sadly, leaning on the table. "I thought about the life insurance, but my dad's lawyer said I'm not the beneficiary." "Oh, really?" I chuckled at his words, which surprised Bob. "You don't think Catherine would be the one your dad left it to?" "No, it's not me." "Then why did you laugh?" "Just felt a bit sorry for you, that's all. If it was insurance, I wouldn't have inherited the debts." "Exactly. That's why my father-in-law had Jack give up the inheritance. He left something for Jack through life insurance. Jack was the beneficiary of my father-in-law's life insurance." "Is that all you wanted to talk about? If so, I'm leaving." "There's nothing I can do for you," I said firmly. "Wait, can't we start over? I was just upset about my dad back then, but I truly care about you, Catherine," Bob pleaded. "You mean you only see me as a dollar sign, right?" "I know." Bob tried to deny it, but I wasn't fooled again. "After all, I don't have a single dime to give to someone like you." "Well, someone important is waiting for me at home." With that, I left the diner. I could hear Bob crying out, but it didn't affect me. I needed to hurry home. Jack might be hungry, or maybe he got something from his grandma. I quickly headed to the subway station. As for Bob, I heard he's working multiple part-time jobs to pay off his debts. With no work experience, qualifications, or motivation, he couldn't get a full-time job anywhere. I once saw him working at a convenience store while I was on my way to a client. He looked much older and thinner, quite shocking. Bob, who had been relying on others, was now facing the consequences. There's no sympathy for him. On the other hand, I'm living peacefully with Jack. We even argue sometimes now. It's saddening when Jack ignores me after a fight, but I try to see it as a sign that he's opening up to me. I plan to support him until he can stand on his own 2 feet. That's probably what my father-in-law wished for, and it's my goal in life now.